Sweat dripped down David's face as cold steel bit into his wrists. Handcuffs clicked shut, echoing through a tense, silent room. Captain Richard Harris sneered, spitting out a single degrading word. Boy. Harris thought he held absolute power over a helpless victim. He felt untouchable behind a shiny silver badge. Little did Harris know, heavily armed federal agents were already surrounding his corrupt precinct. Justice was coming fast, wearing Kevlar and carrying battering rams. Karma never forgets, and tonight, arrogance would meet total destruction. Sirens wailed outside, signaling an end to decades of unchecked abuse. The rain had been falling in a relentless, miserable sheet across the grimy asphalt of Miller Avenue for 3 straight hours. Streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. David Sterling gripped the leather steering wheel of his rented charcoal gray sedan, his eyes periodically checking the rearview mirror. He was a 42-year-old man with graying hair at his temples, dressed in a sharp, tailored Navy suit that spoke of quiet success. To anyone looking closely, he appeared to be a successful corporate executive navigating the wrong side of town after dark. But David was far from a wandering executive. Beneath the crisp cotton of his dress shirt, taped securely against his ribs, was a state-of-the-art wire transmitter. David intentionally slowed his vehicle as he passed the rusted chain-link fence bordering an abandoned industrial park. He knew exactly whose territory he was driving through. This was the undisputed domain of the 8th Precinct, a notorious district governed not by the rule of law, but by the heavy, corrupt hand of Captain Richard Harris. For nearly a decade, Harris and his inner circle of loyal officers had operated an extortion and narcotics ring right out of the station. They targeted out-of-towners, minorities, and anyone they deemed powerless enough to bully, framing them, shaking them down, and lining their own pockets. Suddenly, a blinding burst of red and blue strobes flooded David's rearview mirror. The wail of a police siren shattered the rhythmic drumming of the rain. David exhaled a slow, controlled breath. Showtime, he thought. He pulled the sedan over to the shoulder, shifting the car into park and keeping his hands clearly visible on the steering wheel. Through the side mirror, he watched as 2 squad cars pulled up behind him, aggressively angling their vehicles to box him in. 4 officers stepped out into the downpour. Among them, recognizable by the heavy, swaggering gait and the rain-slicked captain's bars on his collar, was Richard Harris himself. It was unusual for a precinct captain to be conducting routine traffic stops at 11 o'clock at night, but Harris was a micromanager when it came to his illicit operations. He liked to be on the front lines when a high-end vehicle ventured into his trap. A flashlight beam abruptly blinded David as an officer slammed a heavy palm against the driver's side window. "Roll it down, now," commanded a harsh, grating voice. David pressed the button, letting the cold, damp air rush into the quiet cabin. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone measured and respectful. Captain Harris shoved the younger patrolman aside, leaning his broad, imposing frame down to peer into the vehicle. Harris had a deeply lined face, a ruddy complexion, and eyes that held a cold, predatory gleam. He chewed on the inside of his cheek, his gaze sweeping over David's expensive suit, the pristine interior of the car, and finally settling on David's dark skin. A slow, ugly smirk spread across Harris's face. "License and registration," Harris demanded, extending a thick hand. David calmly reached into his breast pocket and produced his driver's license, a carefully fabricated alias, along with the rental agreement. "Here you go, Captain." Harris snatched the documents. He didn't even look at them. Instead, he shined his heavy maglite directly into David's eyes. "You're a long way from the country club, aren't you? What's a guy like you doing driving through my streets at this hour?" "I'm just passing through on my way to my hotel downtown," David replied evenly, blinking against the harsh light. "I wasn't speeding, and my taillights are functioning perfectly. May I ask why I was pulled over?" Harris chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that prompted chuckles from the 3 other officers standing in the rain. "You crossed the center line back there. Swerving. Smells to me like you might have been drinking. I haven't had a drop of alcohol," David stated firmly. "Step out of the car," Harris ordered, his tone shifting from mocking to violently aggressive. He rested his hand heavily on the butt of his holstered service weapon. "I said step out of the car. Now," David complied. He unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the pouring rain. The cold water immediately soaked through his suit, but he stood tall, towering a few inches over Captain Harris. Harris didn't like that. He stepped into David's personal space, trying to intimidate him. "Turn around." Hands on the roof of the car. As David placed his hands on the wet metal, he felt rough hands grabbing his legs, kicking his feet apart. An officer ruthlessly patted him down, patting his pockets, checking his ankles. The officer's hands brushed over the area near David's ribs where the wire was hidden, but the bulky material of the suit and the hurried, sloppy nature of the search masked the device. "He's clean, Captain," the younger officer reported. Harris scowled. He stepped up behind David, leaning in close so David could smell the stale tobacco and peppermint on the captain's breath. "You think because you're wearing a fancy suit, you can come through my town and do whatever you want?" Harris whispered maliciously. "You people always think you're above the law when you get a little bit of money." "I haven't broken any laws, Captain," David replied, his voice calm, ensuring the hidden microphone captured every syllable clearly. "I am simply exercising my right to travel on a public road." Harris grabbed David roughly by the shoulder, spinning him around to face him. The captain's face was twisted in an ugly snarl of pure racial animus and unbridled arrogance. He leaned in, jabbing a thick, calloused finger hard into David's chest. "Listen to me, boy," Harris spat, the derogatory slur slicing through the rainy night air. "Out here, I am the law. You don't have rights. You have whatever I decide to give you." David's jaw tightened, but he maintained eye contact, his expression neutral. "Are you arresting me, Captain? Because if not, I'd like to leave." Harris laughed aloud. "Oh, you're not going anywhere, boy. We're taking you in. Resisting arrest, suspicion of narcotics possession, and whatever else I decide to write on the report when we get back to the station." "You don't have any narcotics to charge me with," David pointed out. Harris pulled a small, clear plastic bag containing a white powdery substance from his own uniform pocket and held it up to the flashing police lights. "I just found this in your center console. Looks like a felony to me." David looked at the planted evidence, a cold fire burning in his chest. "I see. Cuff him," Harris barked to his men. Rough hands yanked David's arms behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit sharply into his wrists, ratcheted tight enough to cut off the circulation. As they shoved him toward the back of the cruiser, David bowed his head against the rain. He wasn't scared. He was silently counting the minutes. The 8th Precinct was a crumbling brick fortress built in the late 1960s, a building that seemed to absorb the despair of the neighborhood it was supposed to protect. The interior smelled of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and the undeniable stench of unwashed bodies and fear. Fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly overhead, flickering and casting an unhealthy, pallid glow over the worn linoleum floors. David was forcefully marched through the heavy double doors by 2 patrolmen, Captain Harris trailing closely behind. The bullpen was relatively quiet for a Tuesday night. A few officers sat at their battered metal desks, typing sluggishly on outdated computers or nursing styrofoam cups of coffee. They looked up as David was brought in, their eyes registering a brief flicker of curiosity before settling back into apathetic indifference. They had seen this 100 times before. Harris bringing in a random mark for a shakedown was business as usual. "Put him in holding cell 3, Harris ordered, stripping off his wet uniform jacket and tossing it onto a nearby chair. "And don't bother booking him just yet. I want to have a little chat with our high-rolling friend first." David was pushed down a narrow, dimly lit corridor that smelled heavily of bleach and urine. The officer unlocked the heavy iron door of cell 3 and shoved David inside. He stumbled forward, catching his balance just before hitting the concrete wall, his hands still tightly bound behind his back. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, the metallic clang echoing with grim finality as the deadbolt slid into place. The cell was barren, containing only a metal bench bolted to the floor and a stainless steel toilet in the corner. David slowly turned around, backing up to the bars so he could lean against them. He began to subtly flex his wrists, testing the tension of the cuffs, while taking slow, deep breaths to regulate his heart rate. 10 minutes passed. The precinct was eerily quiet, save for the muffled ringing of a telephone down the hall. Through the small wire mesh window in his cell door, David could see a portion of Captain Harris's glass-walled office at the end of the corridor. Harris was sitting at his large mahogany desk, completely visible. David watched with cold, calculating eyes as another officer, Sergeant Thomas Reynolds, a man known to be Harris's primary bagman, entered the office carrying a brown paper grocery bag. Reynolds set the bag on the desk. Harris opened it, reaching inside to pull out thick stacks of banded $20 and $50 bills. The two men laughed, dividing the cash, slipping bundles into desk drawers and their own pockets. It was a brazen display of corruption, done in the open because they believed they were utterly invincible. They believed the badge shielded them from any consequences. Presently, Harris stood up, leaving the remaining cash on his desk, and walked down the corridor toward David's cell. He held a clipboard in one hand and a cheap ballpoint pen in the other. He stopped in front of the bars, a smug, satisfied grin plastered across his face. "So," Harris began, tapping the pen against the iron bars. "David, is it? We ran your plates. Rental car. No local address. You're a long way from home, sitting in my jail with a bag of cocaine. That's a mandatory minimum sentence, you know. Years in a state penitentiary. It's a harsh place for a guy who wears a Rolex. What do you want, Captain?" David asked, his voice steady, projecting loudly enough for the microphone taped to his ribs to pick up every word. Harris leaned closer to the bars, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "What I want is to help you out, boy. See, the criminal justice system is clogged. Paperwork is a hassle. Sometimes, a fine, upstanding citizen makes a mistake, and I'm in a position to let that mistake disappear for the right administrative fee. Are you asking me for a bribe?" Harris chuckled, shaking his head. "I wouldn't use such an ugly word. Think of it as a localized fine. $10,000. Cash. You make a phone call, have someone bring the money to a location my sergeant provides, and that bag of white powder goes missing. The door opens. You walk out, and we never see each other again. And if I refuse?" David asked. Harris's face hardened, the faux-friendly facade dropping instantly. "If you refuse, I ruin your life. I lock you up. I make sure the arrest hits the papers. You lose your job, your reputation, your freedom. I'll make sure the judge throws the book at you. And believe me, the judges around here listen to me. You would destroy an innocent man's life just for $10,000? David pressed, ensuring the audio feed was getting crystal clear evidence of extortion. "Innocent?" Harris sneered. "Nobody's innocent, boy. And to me, you're just another paycheck. Now, do we have a deal? Or do I start filling out this felony arrest report?" David looked at Harris, really looked at him. He saw a man who had spent decades intoxicated by his own minor authority, a man who had hurt countless people without a shred of remorse. The arrogance radiating off Harris was suffocating. "I think," David said softly, a ghost of a smile finally touching his lips. "You should go ahead and fill out the report, Richard." Harris blinked, taken aback by the use of his first name. His face flushed a deep, violent crimson. "What did you say to me?" I said. "Fill out the report, because you're going to need all the paperwork you can get to explain what happens next. You arrogant piece of trash." Harris spat, slamming his fist against the cell door. "You think you can disrespect me in my own house? I'm going to bury you." Harris turned on his heel and stormed back down the hallway toward his office, furious that his easy mark was proving stubborn. He threw the clipboard onto his desk and began furiously shouting orders at Sergeant Reynolds. In his cell, David closed his eyes. He mentally reviewed the checklist. Illegal traffic stop? Check. Planted evidence? Check. Racial discrimination? Check. Explicit extortion on tape? Check. He leaned his head back against the cold concrete wall. Any minute now, he thought. 3 blocks away, parked in the shadowed alleyway behind a closed laundromat, a matte black mobile command center sat idling in the rain. Inside the heavily modified RV, a wall of monitors glowed, displaying thermal imaging, street camera feeds, and real-time audio waveforms. Special agent in charge, Jonathan Brooks, stood with his arms crossed over his tactical vest, listening intensely to the audio feed pumping through the speakers. Brooks was a formidable man, a 25-year veteran of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. He had spent the last 2 years building a watertight case against Captain Richard Harris and the 8th Precinct. The speakers crackled. "You arrogant piece of trash. I'm going to bury you." Harris's voice echoed through the command center. Brooks picked up a radio microphone. "We have it," he said, his voice deadly calm. "We have the extortion demand on tape. The subject is secure in holding cell 3. All units, move in. Execute." Around the perimeter of the 8th Precinct, shadows suddenly began to move. Dozens of heavily armed FBI SWAT agents, clad in dark tactical gear with the bold yellow letters FBI emblazoned on their backs, advanced through the pouring rain. They moved with absolute, silent precision. Inside the precinct, Captain Harris was still fuming at his desk. He was aggressively counting the stacks of dirty money, trying to calm his nerves. Sergeant Reynolds was pouring himself a cup of coffee at the break station. The junior officers in the bullpen were scrolling through their phones. The tranquility was shattered in an instant. Crash! The reinforced front doors of the precinct were violently blown off their hinges by a mechanical battering ram. Smoke and rain blew into the lobby as a sea of tactical agents flooded the room. "FBI, nobody move, hands in the air." The shouts were deafening, a coordinated wall of sound designed to shock and paralyze. Red laser sights painted the chests of the stunned precinct officers. An officer near the door instinctively reached for his holster. "Don't do it," an FBI agent roared, aiming a customized M4 carbine directly at the man's face. "Hands off the weapon." "Get on the ground." Panic erupted. The precinct officers, men who were used to being the apex predators in their neighborhood, instantly realized they were vastly outgunned and outmatched. One by one, they dropped to their knees, raising their hands in surrender. Weapons were swiftly confiscated, and zip ties were secured around their wrists. In his glass-enclosed office, Captain Harris froze. The stack of $100 bills slipped from his numb fingers, fluttering down to the desk. He stared through the glass, his eyes wide with absolute horror, watching his kingdom collapse in a matter of seconds. Agent Jonathan Brooks strode through the breached doors, his presence commanding the room. He didn't carry a rifle. His sidearm remained holstered. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who held all the cards. Brooks pointed at the glass office. "Breach it." 2 tactical agents sprinted down the hall. Harris finally found his voice. "Wait, what is the meaning of this? I am the commanding officer of this precinct," he shouted, stumbling toward his office door. Before he could turn the handle, the door was kicked open, shattering the frosted glass. The agents grabbed Harris, slamming him face first down onto his own desk, right on top of the scattered, dirty money. "Captain Richard Harris, you are under arrest for extortion, civil rights violations, narcotics trafficking, and racketeering," Agent Brooks said as he entered the office, his voice echoing in the small space. "You can't do this," Harris screamed, struggling against the agents pinning his arms. "I'm a police captain. You have no jurisdiction here." "Who authorized this?" "I did." A calm voice echoed from down the hallway. Harris strained his neck, looking past Agent Brooks. Walking down the corridor, rubbing his freshly freed wrists, was the man from Cell 3, the man in the tailored suit, the man he had just called boy. David Sterling stepped into the office, his demeanor entirely changed. The facade of the frightened civilian was gone, replaced by an aura of absolute crushing authority. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather badge case, flipping it open to reveal a gold shield. "David Sterling, Deputy Assistant Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation," David introduced himself, his voice cold as ice. "I oversee the Public Corruption and Civil Rights Division out of Washington." The color rapidly drained from Harris's face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes darted from David's gold badge to the wire transmitter that was now visible beneath David's unbuttoned dress shirt. "You," Harris stammered, his bravado entirely shattered. "You set me up." "No, Richard," David corrected him, leaning over the desk so he was face to face with the disgraced captain. "I just drove through your jurisdiction. You set yourself up. You took the bait because you're arrogant, corrupt, and you truly believed your badge made you a god." David reached out and deliberately, slowly, unpinned the silver captain's badge from Harris's uniform shirt. "You don't deserve this," David said, tossing the badge onto the floor. "And you certainly don't deserve to hold power over anyone else." Agent Brooks looked at David. "Sir, we have the rest of the precinct secured." Evidence recovery teams are standing by to rip this place apart. Good, David replied, turning his back on Harris. Tear the walls down if you have to. Find every ledger, every stash of drugs, every stolen dollar. I want this entire precinct dismantled by morning. As they hauled Captain Harris to his feet and slapped heavy iron cuffs on his wrists, the very same cuffs he had so gleefully clamped onto David just an hour prior, Harris looked utterly broken. The realization of his fate was crashing down on him. He wasn't just losing his job. He was going to federal prison for a very, very long time. Oh. And Richard? David called out just as the agents were dragging the disgraced captain out the door. Harris looked back, his eyes hollow, desperate. David adjusted his suit jacket, his expression completely unreadable. By 2 a.m., the 8th precinct no longer resembled a police station. It looked like an active demolition zone. Floodlights powered by roaring diesel generators illuminated the crumbling brick facade, casting stark, elongated shadows across Miller Avenue. The heavy rain had finally reduced to a miserable drizzle, but the atmosphere inside the building was crackling with intense, methodical energy. Dozens of FBI evidence response team members, wearing blue windbreakers and latex gloves, were systematically dissecting Captain Richard Harris's corrupt empire. David Sterling stood in the center of the bullpen, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand. He had shed his wet suit jacket, his shoulder holster now visible over his crisp white shirt. He watched with a quiet, steely satisfaction as the precinct's dark secrets were dragged kicking and screaming into the light. We just hit the jackpot in the evidence lockup, sir. Agent Jonathan Brooks announced, walking over with a heavy, dust-covered cardboard box. He set it down on a nearby desk with a dull thud. David peered into the box. Inside were rows of neatly packaged narcotics, cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl that had never been logged into the official system. Beside the drugs were bundles of cash held together by rubber bands and a collection of illegal firearms with their serial numbers filed off. Harris was running his own cartel right out of the evidence room, Brooks explained, disgust evident in his voice. Whenever his boys made a bust, they'd skim half the product off the top before filing the report. Then they'd use the stolen drugs to plant on innocent people like you, or sell it back to rival gangs through intermediaries. A self-sustaining cycle of misery. David muttered, his jaw tightening. What about the paper trail? Men like Harris always keep a ledger. They're too greedy not to track what they're owed. We found it, Brooks said, pulling a worn black leather-bound notebook from his tactical vest. Sergeant Reynolds had it locked in a false bottom of his desk drawer. It's written in a rudimentary shorthand, but it won't take our cryptanalysts more than an hour to break it. It lists names, businesses, and dates of collections. David took the ledger, flipping through the pages. The sheer volume of entries was staggering. Hundreds of names. Hundreds of lives disrupted, ruined, or extorted by the men sworn to protect them. He stopped on a page dated 2 years prior. A name caught his eye. Samuel Higgins. $5,000. Mo. Refused. Handled. Pull the arrest records for a Samuel Higgins, David ordered, handing the book back to Brooks. Let's see what handled means in Captain Harris's vocabulary. 10 minutes later, Brooks returned with a faded manila folder. Samuel Higgins. 62 years old. Owned a family hardware store on 4th and Elm. Right in the heart of this precinct. Never had a speeding ticket in his life. 2 years ago, Harris's men raided his store on an anonymous tip. Claimed they found stolen construction equipment in the back warehouse. Higgins lost his business license, went bankrupt trying to fight the charges, and ended up pleading guilty to avoid a 10-year sentence. He's currently doing 3 years at the state penitentiary. David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Higgins was just a hardware store owner who had refused to pay Harris's mafia-style protection racket. For his defiance, his life was completely dismantled. The word boy that Harris had spat at David echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a racial slur. It was a declaration of absolute, unaccountable dominance. We're going to get Higgins out, David said firmly. I want a team looking into every single conviction originating from this precinct over the last 10 years. Every piece of evidence is now compromised. We are going to vacate hundreds of sentences. Sir, there's something else, Brooks said, his tone shifting. lowering his voice so only David could hear. While we were tearing apart Harris's private office, we found a burner phone taped underneath the floorboards beneath his desk. We plugged it into the Celebrite machine to pull the data. And Harris wasn't operating in a vacuum, Brooks revealed, handing David a tablet displaying a transcript of text messages. He had a judicial rubber stamp. Look at the contacts. He's been communicating with someone saved under the initial C. Harris would text a name and an address, and C would reply with, "Paperwork signed." Drop the envelope at the usual spot. David read the transcripts, his eyes narrowing. Warrants were being signed without probable cause, in exchange for cash bribes delivered in envelopes. Harris was the muscle, but he had a powerful ally on the bench keeping the operation legally insulated. "Do we know who C is?" David asked. Cross-referencing the cell tower pings from the burner phone's history, Brooks replied, tapping the screen. The receiving phone spends its days at the downtown county courthouse, and its nights at a gated estate in the wealthy northern suburbs. The property is registered to a trust fund controlled by the Honorable Judge Robert Caldwell. David looked up, a sharp, predatory glint in his eyes. Judge Robert Caldwell was a highly respected, tough-on-crime local magistrate. He was known for handing out maximum sentences and grandstanding in the press about cleaning up the streets. Behind closed doors, he was profiting off the very corruption he publicly condemned. The scope of the investigation had just expanded from a dirty police precinct to the highest levels of the city's judicial system. Harris is currently being processed at the federal holding facility, Brooks noted. He's screaming for a lawyer, demanding to make phone calls. "Let him stew," David said, tossing his empty coffee cup into a trash can. "Make sure he's in a cold cell with nothing but a concrete bench. Let the reality of his situation sink in. Tomorrow morning, we're going to go have a chat with our former captain. We don't just want him anymore. We want Caldwell, and Harris is going to hand him to us." Federal Detention Center, Room 4B, was a windowless, sterile box consisting of gray cinderblock walls, a steel table bolted to the floor, and 3 metal chairs. The air conditioning was intentionally kept a few degrees too low, designed to make subjects feel physically uncomfortable and psychologically vulnerable. Richard Harris sat at the steel table. The arrogant, swaggering police captain from the night before was entirely gone. In his place sat a defeated, exhausted man wearing a bright orange canvas jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a heavy chain wrapped around his waist. He hadn't slept. He hadn't been allowed to make a phone call. For 8 hours he had been left alone in solitary confinement, isolated with nothing but his own racing, terrified thoughts. The heavy steel door clicked open. David Sterling walked in, followed closely by Agent Brooks. David was back in a perfectly tailored suit, looking fresh, sharp, and utterly imposing. He carried a thick manila folder, which he tossed onto the metal table with a loud, jarring smack. Harris jumped slightly at the noise, his bloodshot eyes darting up to meet David's gaze. "Good morning, Richard," David said, his voice smooth, devoid of any anger. He pulled out a chair and sat down opposite the disgraced captain. Brooks remained standing by the door, an intimidating, silent sentinel. "I trust your accommodations were satisfactory? It's a bit of a step down from your corner office, but you'll have a few decades to get used to it." Harris swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I want my lawyer. I know my rights." "You do," David agreed amiably. "And you will get a lawyer. Eventually. But right now, this is a courtesy call. An informational session, if you will. Because the train is leaving the station, Richard, and you need to decide if you want to be under the wheels or in the caboose." "You set me up," Harris rasped, clinging to his last shred of defensive anger. "This is entrapment." Brooks let out a short, mocking laugh. David simply smiled. "Entrapment implies we convinced you to commit a crime you wouldn't normally commit," David explained, opening the folder. He pulled out an 8x10 glossy photograph and slid it across the table. It was a picture of the black ledger found in Sergeant Reynolds' desk. Harris's face went ash-white. "We found the ledger, Richard. We found the stash of stolen narcotics in your evidence room. We found the illegal firearms. We have the audio recording of you extorting me for $10,000 while calling me a racial slur. We have the body camera footage of you planting cocaine in my vehicle." David paused, letting the weight of the evidence crush down on the man. That's not entrapment. That's a Tuesday night for you. We just finally put a microphone in the room." Harris stared at the photo of the ledger, his hands trembling slightly against his chains. The reality of his absolute destruction was no longer a theoretical fear. It was sitting in a folder right in front of him. Federal sentencing guidelines for racketeering under the RICO Act, combined with civil rights violations under color of law, armed narcotics trafficking, and extortion, David recited calmly, will land you a mandatory minimum of 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. You are 55 years old, Richard. You will die in a cage. Harris closed his eyes, a bead of sweat tracing down his forehead despite the chill in the room. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You already took my badge. You destroyed my life. You destroyed your own life." David corrected sharply, his voice dropping an octave. The friendly facade vanishing. "You destroyed Samuel Higgins' life. You ruined hundreds of lives because you liked the power. You liked making people feel small. You called me boy because you thought you were untouchable. Now you are nothing." Harris flinched, unable to meet David's eyes. "But," David continued, leaning back in his chair, "the Department of Justice is sometimes willing to be pragmatic. I don't just want the muscle, Richard. I want the brain." David reached into the folder and pulled out a second photograph. He slid it over the ledger. It was a picture of the burner phone found under the floorboards. Harris gasped, a genuine sound of panic escaping his lips. "We know about C," David said softly. "We know Judge Robert Caldwell has been signing your bogus warrants in exchange for a cut of your extortion money. We have the texts. But texts are circumstantial. A smart defense attorney could argue you were texting a different C or that Caldwell's phone was hacked. I want him dead to rights. Caldwell will kill me." Harris stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "You don't understand. He's connected. He has friends in the state capitol. He has friends in the mob. If I give him up, if you don't give him up, you are the apex of this conspiracy, and you take the full 45 years. David interrupted, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "If you cooperate, if you testify against Judge Caldwell in open court, I will personally recommend to the U.S. Attorney that your sentence be reduced to 10 years in a minimum security, white-collar facility. You'll be out when you're 65. You'll get to see the sun again." Harris stared at the metal table, agonizing over the impossible choice. Loyalty to a corrupt judge who would happily watch him burn, or spending the rest of his natural life in a concrete box surrounded by the very criminals he used to beat and frame. "How?" Harris finally asked, his voice barely a breath. "How do we get him?" A slow, chilling smile spread across David's face. It was the smile of a hunter who had just closed the trap. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a small, flat electronic device. A state-of-the-art wire transmitter, identical to the one he had worn the night before. He slid the transmitter across the table until it touched Harris's shackled hands. "Karma is a funny thing, Richard," David said, his eyes locking onto the broken captain. "You are going to put this on. You are going to call Judge Caldwell. Tell him the FBI raided your precinct, but you managed to hide the emergency stash of cash. You are going to arrange a meeting to pay him off one last time, so he can help you secure a lawyer and flee the state." Harris stared at the wire, realizing the poetic justice of his situation. He had been caught by a wire, and now, his only salvation was to wear one himself. He had become the very thing he despised, a rat, an informant, a pawn controlled by a man he had thoughtlessly dismissed as a boy. "And when you meet him," David concluded, his voice ringing with absolute, final authority, "you are going to get him to confess to everything on tape. Because if you don't, I will personally ensure you spend your final days locked in the dark." Harris slowly reached out, his trembling fingers brushing against the cold plastic of the transmitter. "I'll do it," he whispered, completely broken. "I'll wear the wire." The Oakwood Country Club was an enclave of extreme generational wealth, nestled securely behind high wrought-iron gates in the city's lush northern suburbs. It was a place where multi-million-dollar deals were struck over scotch and cigars, far removed from the grime, rain, and desperation of Miller Avenue. At twilight, the The sprawling 18-hole golf course was bathed in a serene golden glow, the manicured greens looking almost artificial in their perfection. Parked discreetly on a service road adjacent to the 16th hole was a seemingly ordinary municipal water maintenance van. Inside, the atmosphere was a pressure cooker of focused intensity. Agent Jonathan Brooks adjusted the dials on a sophisticated audio receiver, his headphones clamped tightly to his ears. Beside him, David Sterling watched the grainy feed from a long-lens thermal camera mounted on the van's roof. "Transmitter check," Brooks muttered into a microphone. "Read you loud and clear, Captain. Remember, keep him talking. We need the specific quid pro quo on tape." A mile away, sitting in the passenger seat of a customized electric golf cart, Richard Harris wiped a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead. He was dressed in khaki slacks and a polo shirt, trying desperately to blend in, but he felt as though he were wearing a neon sign. Beneath his shirt, the adhesive tape holding the wire transmitter pulled uncomfortably against his skin. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had spent his entire career being the predator. Playing the bait was entirely foreign to him. A second golf cart approached from the fairway, rolling to a silent stop beside Harris's vehicle. Behind the wheel sat the Honorable Judge Robert Caldwell. Caldwell was a man in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair, a deep tan that spoke of frequent Caribbean vacations, and the casual, dismissive posture of a man who believed the world existed solely to serve him. He wore a pristine white golf glove and carried a custom-fitted titanium driver. Caldwell dismissed his caddy with a sharp wave of his hand, waiting until the young man was out of earshot before turning his glacial blue eyes upon Harris. "You look awful, Richard," Caldwell noted, his voice smooth, cultured, and laced with distinct condescension. "And you are remarkably late. I abhor tardiness. What was so urgent that you felt the need to disrupt my back nine?" Harris swallowed the lump in his throat. He forced himself to look at the judge, channeling every ounce of genuine terror he felt into his performance. "The precinct was raided, Robert. Last night, the FBI came through the front doors with battering rams. They tore the place down to the studs." Caldwell's expression didn't change, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. "I know about the raid, Richard. It's all over the morning news. What I want to know is why you are sitting here instead of in a federal holding cell." I managed to slip out during the chaos," Harris lied, his voice trembling perfectly. "They hit the evidence lockup, but they didn't find the secondary stash, the safety deposit box at the downtown branch. I cleared it out this morning. I have $200,000 in untraceable cash in the trunk of my car." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. The mention of the money was the hook. David, listening in the van, leaned closer to the monitor. "Take the bait, Robert," David thought. "200,000, Caldwell repeated softly, looking out over the manicured green. "A substantial sum, but hardly enough to buy your way out of a federal RICO indictment, Richard. You're radioactive. I don't need to buy my way out of the federal charges yet." "I need time," Harris pleaded, leaning closer to the judge, ensuring the microphone picked up every syllable. "I need a high-powered defense attorney, and I need you to guarantee that if the feds try to kick any of the narcotics charges down to the state level, you'll quash the warrants, just like you did for the Miller kid, just like you've done for the last 5 years." In the surveillance van, Brooks held his breath. This was the critical moment. Caldwell let out a long, exasperated sigh. He reached into his golf bag, pulled out a monogrammed towel, and meticulously wiped down the grip of his driver. "You are a blunt instrument, Richard," Caldwell sneered, a venomous edge bleeding into his refined voice. "You have always lacked finesse. I provide the legal shield. I sign the blank warrants. I suppress the inconvenient evidence, and I ensure the judicial machinery grinds in our favor. In exchange, you provide the capital. That was our arrangement, but you got sloppy." "I wasn't sloppy," Harris protested, playing the desperate fool. "I just need to know you have my back, Robert. I've paid you over $1 million in the last 3 years. I've made you rich." Caldwell scoffed, a dark, arrogant chuckle escaping his lips. "You didn't make me rich, Richard. You merely supplemented my income. Do you truly believe you are my only revenue stream? I hold this entire county in the palm of my hand. The police, the prosecutors, The defense attorneys, they all dance to my tune because I control the gavel. If I want a case dismissed, it vanishes. If I want a man buried, he disappears into the state penitentiary. I am the law. Caldwell leaned in, pointing a manicured finger directly at Harris's chest, right over the hidden microphone. I will take the $200,000, Richard. Consider it a severance package. I will make a few phone calls to ensure you get a competent attorney. But if you ever contact me again, or if you ever breathe a word of our arrangement to those federal Boy Scouts, I will not just ruin you. I will have you quietly eradicated in whichever prison they send you to. Do we understand each other? In the van, David Sterling pulled back from the monitor. A cold, satisfied calm washed over him. He pressed the button on his encrypted radio. We have it, David commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He gave us the whole kingdom. Move in and take them down. The serenity of the Oakwood Country Club was violently shattered. Before Caldwell could even retract his threatening finger from Harris's chest, the tree line bordering the fairway erupted. Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents, clad in tactical vests and windbreakers, surged onto the pristine grass. Black SUVs with flashing red and blue strobe lights tore across the meticulously maintained golf course, tearing deep, muddy gashes into the turf. Caldwell froze, his face draining of all color as the realization hit him. He turned wildly, looking for an escape route, but the golf cart was instantly surrounded. FBI. Nobody move. Keep your hands where we can see them. Agent Brooks was the first to reach the carts, his weapon drawn and aimed squarely at the judge. Robert Caldwell, step out of the vehicle and interlace your fingers behind your head. Now, Caldwell's refined demeanor completely evaporated. Panic and indignity warped his features. What is the meaning of this? He bellowed, his voice echoing across the silent golf course, drawing the shocked stares of wealthy club members from the nearby clubhouse patio. I am a sitting judge. You have no jurisdiction to ambush me like a common criminal. David Sterling stepped out from behind the line of tactical agents. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the tactical gear surrounding him. He stopped a few feet from the golf cart, looking down at the red-faced, sputtering judge. The law doesn't care about your title, Robert, David said, his voice carrying clearly over the warm evening air. And as of this moment, you are no longer a sitting judge. You are a federal suspect. Caldwell's eyes darted from David to Harris, who was sitting perfectly still, his head bowed in absolute defeat. Caldwell saw the outline of the wire beneath Harris's polo shirt. You, Caldwell spat, directing his venom at his former partner. You wore a wire? You treacherous, pathetic piece of trash. He did what he had to do to survive. Robert, David interjected smoothly. Just like the people you've been locking up for years. You built an empire on arrogance, assuming that a black robe made you untouchable. You thought justice was something you could sell to the highest bidder. You have nothing on me, Caldwell shouted, though the desperation in his voice betrayed his fear. This is a setup, an illegal sting. We have you explicitly detailing an extortion racket, admitting to judicial tampering, and threatening to order a murder inside a federal penitentiary. David corrected him, his tone turning to ice. We have the bank records of your offshore shell companies, courtesy of the ledgers we seized from Captain Harris's precinct. We have it all. Your gavel just broke. Agents moved in, rough hands grabbing Caldwell, forcing his arms behind his back. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around the judge's wrists echoed loudly. It was the very same sound David had heard in the rain on Miller Avenue just 48 hours prior. Read him his rights, David ordered, and process him at the federal building. Make sure the media gets a good look at him during the perp walk. As Caldwell was dragged away, cursing and shouting empty threats, David turned his attention to Richard Harris. The former captain looked up, his eyes hollow, expecting to be congratulated or perhaps offered a shred of dignity. You held up your end of the bargain, Richard, David said coldly. The U.S. attorney will be notified of your cooperation. You won't die in prison, but you will still spend the next 10 years locked in a cage. Take him away. The fallout from the Miller Avenue sting and the Oakwood Country Club raid was catastrophic for the city's corrupt power structure. The news dominated national headlines for weeks. The 8th Precinct was entirely disbanded, its officers either indicted on federal racketeering charges or fired and stripped of their pensions. The brick fortress that had once stood as a symbol of terror was scheduled for demolition. Judge Robert Caldwell, stripped of his power, his wealth seized by federal asset forfeiture, was convicted by a jury of his peers in a trial that lasted less than 2 weeks. His own audio recording was the final nail in his coffin. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, his legacy utterly destroyed, remembered only as a disgraceful stain on the judicial system. But the true victory wasn't just in the arrests. The real triumph lay in the aftermath. Armed with the confiscated ledgers and Caldwell's communications, the Department of Justice launched a massive review of every conviction tied to the 8th Precinct in Caldwell's courtroom over the past decade. It was a Herculean task, but David Sterling personally oversaw the division responsible for righting the wrongs. 3 months after the raid, the heavy iron gates of the state penitentiary swung open. Samuel Higgins, the 62-year-old hardware store owner, who had been framed and imprisoned for refusing to pay Captain Harris's extortion fee, walked out into the bright morning sunlight. He was greeted by his weeping daughter and a team of federal civil rights attorneys. Higgins was not only fully exonerated, his criminal record wiped completely clean, but he was also awarded a massive settlement from the city, enough to rebuild his life and his family's legacy. He was just the first. Over the next 2 years, nearly 300 wrongful convictions were overturned. Innocent people, targeted because of their race, their poverty, or their vulnerability, were given their lives back. The systemic rot that had poisoned the city for a generation was forcefully, painfully excised. True justice is rarely swift, and it is almost never easy. It requires individuals willing to step into the darkness and confront those who believe power grants them immunity. Captain Richard Harris and Judge Robert Caldwell built a fortress of corruption, convinced that their badges and robes elevated them above the very laws they were sworn to uphold. They operated with a suffocating arrogance, destroying lives on a whim, reducing human beings to derogatory slurs and collateral damage. But their hubris was their ultimate undoing. They forgot that karma is a relentless hunter. It does not care about rank, wealth, or authority. The very mechanisms of oppression they utilized, the handcuffs, the holding cells, the wiretaps, and the unquestionable weight of the law, were ultimately turned against them with devastating precision. The sting on Miller Avenue serves as a stark, enduring reminder. No matter how high the pedestal, no one is untouchable when the arc of the moral universe finally bends toward accountability.